The sky above New York City turned dark at exactly noon on a Tuesday, and it was not because of clouds. 4,000 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and filled the space above Earth like a swarm of iron locusts, blocking the sun and casting shadows over every continent at the same time. And the people of Earth looked up and felt something they had not felt in a very long time, and that something was raw and honest fear. The ships belonged to the Valkyrie Dominion, and every species in the known galaxy knew that name the way a child knows the name of the monster under the bed. Because the Valkyrie had conquered over 300 star systems, and had wiped out entire civilizations before breakfast, and had never once lost a war in over 1,000 years of brutal expansion across the stars. They were massive reptilian creatures, standing over 8 feet tall, with scales like black iron and teeth that could tear through metal. One simple idea, which was that the strong eat the weak, and they had been eating the weak for a very long time. Their supreme warlord was a beast named Drathos Vel, and he sat on the bridge of his flagship, called the Unbroken Jaw, which was a dreadnought the size of a small moon, and he looked down at Earth the way a hawk looks at a mouse running across an open field. He opened a channel and broadcast his message on every frequency in the galaxy, so that every species on every world could hear what he had to say. People of Earth, his voice rumbled through every television and every radio and every phone on the planet. I am Supreme Warlord Drathos Vel of the Valkyrie Dominion, and I give you a gift today, and that gift is time. And I give you 3 standard galactic days to surrender your planet and your colonies and your fleet and your biological autonomy to the Dominion. And if you do this, you will be allowed to serve us as soldiers and laborers. And if you do not do this, then we will take everything from you anyway, and there will be no one left to remember that you ever existed. He paused and let his words settle like poison into the ears of 8 billion people. Most species do not receive this courtesy, he added, with what might have been a smile on his terrible face. Consider it mercy. The transmission ended, and the world erupted into panic for about 6 hours, and then something very interesting happened, and the panic stopped. And it stopped because the Terran Confederation activated its war machine, and the war machine did not panic, because machines do not feel fear. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for about 40 years, and in that time, every other species had looked at them the same way, which was with a mixture of amusement and disgust, because humans were loud and aggressive, and they had spent most of their history killing each other before they finally united under the Terran Confederation and joined the galactic community. Stars and the other species called them the juvenile species, and patted them on the head, and told them to sit down and be quiet while the adults handled things. The Galactic Council, which was supposed to protect its member species, did absolutely nothing when the Valkyrie Armada appeared above Earth, and this surprised exactly no one, because the Council had never once stood up to the Dominion, and everyone knew that the Council was really just a social club for cowards who liked to make speeches while other species burned. So humanity was alone. And that was fine, because humanity had always been alone, and they had gotten very good at surviving on their own. The Terran War Council convened within 2 hours of the ultimatum, and it was a room full of the most dangerous minds on Earth, including admirals and generals and artificial intelligence systems that could calculate 1 billion outcomes per second, and they looked at the situation from every angle, and the decision was unanimous. And the decision was simple. No surrender, and not now, and not ever, and not while a single human being still drew breath. But they needed time, and they needed to send a message to the Valkyrie, and to the entire galaxy. And for that, they needed someone special. And they needed someone who could stand in front of a monster and not blink. They chose Ambassador Alara Mwangi. Alara was 53 years old, and she had short gray hair and calm brown eyes, and a face that revealed absolutely nothing unless she wanted it to. And before she became a diplomat, she had been a colonel in the Terran Marines, and she had seen combat on 4 different worlds, and she had buried friends on 3 of them. But that was not why they chose her. They chose her because 6 years ago, she had served as a diplomatic attaché on a Valkyrie border world called Rethys. And on Rethys, she had seen what the Valkyrie did to conquered species. They sorted the strong from the weak, and she had seen the breeding farms where they turned free people into livestock. And she had seen the eyes of those people, and those eyes were empty, because the Valkyrie did not just conquer your body, they conquered your soul. Ilara had left Rethys with a scar on her left hand, where she had clenched her fist so hard that her own nails had drawn blood, and she had made a quiet promise to the dead that she would never let it happen to her people. The War Council gave her one instruction, and the instruction was this: make them hesitate. She boarded a single unarmed diplomatic shuttle and flew alone toward the Valkyrie Armada, and every sensor on every ship tracked her as she approached, and Drathos Vel watched from his bridge with amusement, because this tiny human female in her tiny little ship was either very brave or very stupid, and he suspected it was the second one. He allowed the communication channel to open because he wanted the galaxy to see what happened when a mouse talked back to a hawk. Ilara stood on the bridge of her shuttle, and she was completely alone and completely calm, and she looked directly into the camera, and she spoke. "Supreme Warlord Drathos Vel," she said, and her voice was steady as stone. "On behalf of the Terran Confederation, I must respectfully decline your generous offer of surrender." The Valkyrie War Council chuckled, and Drathos Vel leaned forward in his throne, with a grin that showed every one of his terrible teeth. "And I must correct a misunderstanding," Ilara continued, and something shifted in her eyes, and it was not fear, and it was not anger, and it was something much worse, and it was certainty. "You gave us 3 days," she said, "but I promise you this. You will not last 3 seconds. The transmission cut to black. Across the galaxy, 100 species watched the replay, and laughed and shook their heads, and said that the humans had lost their minds, and that it was a shame really, because they were an interesting little species. On the bridge of the Unbroken Jaw, Drathos Vel laughed the hardest of all, and he saved the recording so he could play it at his victory feast. But deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a facility that did not appear on any map and did not exist in any database, a red light turned green, and a calm voice spoke into the silence. "Blackthorn Protocol initiated. All stations begin final preparations. Countdown is live." And somewhere in that dark and hidden place, a clock began to tick. The galaxy could not stop laughing. Every news network on every civilized world played the clip of Ambassador Ilara Mwangi, telling the most powerful warlord in the galaxy that he would not last 3 seconds. And the reaction was the same everywhere, which was pure and absolute mockery. On the Torvani homeworld, the aquatic commentators called it the funniest thing a land species had ever said. On the Dren Collective's communication network, the machine intelligences calculated humanity's survival probability at less than 4%. On 100 other worlds, 100 other species shook their heads and started placing bets on how quickly the Valkyrie would finish the job. Aboard the Unbroken Jaw, Supreme Warlord Drathos Vel made Ilara's transmission his personal entertainment, and he played it at every meal and every war briefing. His officers laughed every single time, because it was genuinely funny to them that a species with a fleet of only 200 small ships would dare to threaten an armada of 4,000. But not everyone was laughing. Sub-Commander Yisha was a young Valkyrie officer who served as a tactical analyst on the flagship, and she had spent the last 3 days studying everything the Dominion's intelligence network had on humanity, and something was bothering her, like a bone stuck in her throat. She stood before Drathos Vel in his war room, and she spoke carefully, because speaking carefully was how you stayed alive around the Supreme Warlord. "Sir," she said, "I have completed my analysis of the human defensive network, and I must report something unusual." Drathos Vel looked at her the way a boulder looks at a pebble. "Their defenses are ordinary," she continued. "Their fleet is small, and their orbital platforms are standard, and their ground installations are unremarkable. And that is precisely what concerns me, because nothing about this species is ordinary, and nothing about them has ever been unremarkable." She pulled up data on the display, and it showed humanity's history in the galactic community over the past 40 years. And it was a history of aggression and innovation and stubbornness, and an almost insane willingness to fight against impossible odds. "A species with this behavioral profile," Yisha said, "should not have defenses this weak, and I believe what we are seeing is not the truth of what they have, but only what they want us to see." Drathos Vel stared at her for a long moment, and then he dismissed her with a wave of his massive clawed hand. "You are young," he said, "and youth sees shadows where there is only darkness. And no species has ever bluffed the Dominion and survived to tell the story." Yisha left the war room and said nothing more, but she did not delete her analysis. Meanwhile on Earth, the 3 days were being used, and they were being used very well. The truth about humanity that no other species in the galaxy understood was this: humans were not stupid, and they were not reckless, and they were not the loud, aggressive children that the galaxy believed them to be. And what they actually were was something far more dangerous, and that was patient. For 40 years since joining the galactic community, humanity had played a role, and the role was harmless newcomer. And they had played it perfectly. And while every other species looked down at them and ignored them, the Terran Confederation's intelligence agencies had been doing something very quiet and very thorough. They had been studying everyone. Every major galactic power had been analyzed, and their technology had been catalogued, and their military tactics had been recorded, and their biological weaknesses had been mapped, and most importantly, their secrets had been stolen, and not just a few secrets, but thousands of them, taken over decades by human spies and hackers and undercover operatives who were very good at being overlooked. Because the galaxy had already decided that humans were not worth watching. The result of all this quiet, patient work was a program called Blackthorn. And Blackthorn was the reason Ilara Mwangi had been so calm when she delivered her message. Under Blackthorn, humanity had built weapons that no other species knew existed, and they had built a fleet that no other species had ever seen. And they had hidden all of it in places that no one would think to look, because the galaxy was very large, and humans were very clever about using the empty spaces. The fleet that the galaxy knew about was 200 ships, and those ships were real, and they were fine ships, but they were a mask. And behind the mask was a force of over 3,000 warships, hidden in hollowed-out asteroids and deep craters on the far side of the moon, and underground facilities on Mars, and scattered across dozens of secret stations in the dark spaces between planets. Vessel that no species had ever encountered, called the Wraith-class corvette. And the Wraiths were not crewed by humans, but by advanced artificial intelligence systems that could think and react 1,000 times faster than any living pilot. And they were small and fast, and they hunted in swarms like wolves. But the fleet was not humanity's biggest secret. Beneath the surface of Earth, in a facility buried 3 miles underground, there was a weapon called Ares. And Ares was the thing that kept the generals awake at night, because it was not just a weapon, it was a statement. The Velkari had conquered the galaxy using faster-than-light technology, and humanity had studied that technology and taken it apart, and put it back together in a way that the Velkari had never imagined. And the result was a gravity distortion beam that could create a micro-singularity, which was a tiny black hole that lasted for less than a second, but in that second it could swallow everything within. Radius of 50 kilometers. It was the most terrifying weapon any species had ever built, and humanity had built it in secret and told no one, and prayed they would never have to use it. But now they had to use it. On the second day of the 3-day countdown, Elara visited the Blackthorn Command Center beneath the moon's surface, and she walked through corridors filled with officers and technicians who were working with a calm focus that would have terrified the Velkari if they could have seen it. Because there was no panic here, and there was no doubt, and there was only preparation. She met with Admiral Chen Wei, the commander of the Hidden Fleet, and he was a quiet man with silver hair and steady hands. And he laid out the battle plan on a holographic display, and it was elegant and brutal, and it relied on the Velkari doing exactly what they always did, which was attack with overwhelming force in their famous formation called the Crushing Tide. "They will come straight at us," Chen Wei said, "because they have never had a reason to do anything else, and they will use the Crushing Tide because it has never failed, and their arrogance will be our greatest weapon." Elara looked at the plan, and she saw the thousands of ships, and the Wraith swarms, and the Ares weapon, and she saw the projected casualties on both sides, and the numbers were not small. "How many will we lose?" she asked. Chen Wei met her eyes, and he did not look away. "Thousands," he said, "but we will still be here when it is over." On the final night before the deadline, Elara received an encrypted message from an unexpected source, and the source was the Kireshi, who were an ancient insectoid species that had nearly been destroyed by the Velkari centuries ago, and their ambassador was an old creature named Elder Vass, and his message was short. "We remember what it is to stand alone, and whatever you are planning, do not hesitate." And she thought about Rethus, and the culling pits, and the empty eyes, and she closed her hand and felt the old scar on her palm. She would not hesitate. The final hours ticked away, and the Velkari armada moved into attack formation, and 4,000 warships arranged themselves in the Crushing Tide pattern that had shattered every defense it had ever faced. And Drathos Vel broadcast one final message to Earth. "Your 3 days are over, humans, and now you will learn what every other species has learned before you, which is that the Dominion does not bluff, and the Dominion does not lose, and the Dominion does not forgive." Deep beneath the moon, a calm voice spoke over the intercom. "Blackthorn is live. All stations report ready. Weapons free." The Velkari armada surged forward like a tidal wave made of iron and fire, and 4,000 warships crossed the invisible line that marked the edge of Earth's inner defensive perimeter. And every galactic observer, watching from their distant worlds, expected to see the quick and brutal end of the human species. They did not get what they expected. The first second began when the Velkari fleet crossed the designated threshold, and at that exact moment, something happened in the space around Earth that no one had predicted. And what happened was that 10,000 tiny objects that had been floating in Earth's orbital debris field suddenly came alive. They were called Project Sable, and they had been disguised as space junk for over 12 years, and they were not weapons, and they were not bombs, and they were something much worse, because they were transmitters, and each one of them was calibrated to emit a very specific electromagnetic frequency, and that frequency was the All-I. Exact resonant frequency of Velkari shield generators. Humanity had stolen that frequency 7 years ago from a black market arms dealer on a station at the edge of Velkari space, and they had paid a terrible price for it, because 3 operatives had died getting it out, and those 3 names were now engraved on a wall in the Blackthorn facility, and they had not died for nothing. The 10,000 transmitters fired simultaneously in one perfectly synchronized burst, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic, because every single shield generator on every single Velkari warship overloaded, and failed at the same moment. And it was like watching 4,000 candles get blown out by a single breath. 4,000 warships suddenly had no shields, and in space combat, having no shields was the same as having no skin. The first second ended. The second second began with the moon splitting open, or at least that was what it looked like from Earth. Hidden launch bays on the lunar surface blasted their camouflage covers into space, and from beneath the gray dust, a fleet poured out. And it was not the 200 ships that the galaxy knew about. It was 3,000 warships. They came from the moon, and they came from hollowed asteroids in the belt, and they came from beneath the red surface of Mars, and they came from stations hidden in the darkness between worlds, and the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the real Terran fleet revealed itself. Among them were the Wraith-class corvettes, and they were small and black and fast, and they moved in perfect coordination because they were piloted by artificial intelligence systems that did not feel fear, and did not hesitate, and did not make mistakes. And they poured into the Valkyrie formation like a swarm of hornets attacking a bear. Each wraith carried a single weapon called a kinetic lance, which was essentially a rod of ultra-dense metal accelerated to a fraction of light speed, and when a kinetic lance hit an unshielded hull, it went through it the way a needle goes through wet paper. And the wraiths did not miss, because machines do not miss. The Valkyrie fleet, which had expected to face 200 ships, was suddenly surrounded by 3,000, and they had no shields, and the enemy was already inside their formation. The second second ended. The third second was when the world changed forever. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in the facility that did not exist, a single command was given, and a single weapon fired, and that weapon was Project Ares. The gravity distortion beam lanced upward through the atmosphere and into space, and it struck the exact center of the Valkyrie formation, and for 7/10 of a second it created something that should not exist, which was a localized gravitational singularity. And that singularity was a point in space where gravity became so strong that nothing could escape it, and nothing could resist it. 600 Valkyrie warships were caught in the singularity's pull, and they did not explode, and they did not burn, and they did not scream on any communication channel, because they were simply pulled into a single point and compressed into nothing, and they ceased to exist in any meaningful way. And where 600 warships had been, there was now only a brief flash of light that was brighter than the sun, and then there was nothing. The third second ended. 3 seconds had passed, and in those 3 seconds the Valkyrie had lost their shields and faced an enemy fleet 15 times larger than expected, and watched 600 of their ships vanish into a point of light, and the crushing tide formation, which had been undefeated for 1,000 years, was shattered like glass thrown against the stone wall. On the bridge of the Unbroken Jaw, Supreme Warlord Draethos Vel experienced something that he had never felt before in his entire life, frozen at his command throne. And his officers were screaming reports at him, but he could not hear them, because his mind was trying to process what had just happened. And his mind could not do it, because what had just happened was impossible. Sub-Commander Yisha was bleeding from a wound on her head, where a console had exploded near her, and she looked at Draethos Vel, and she said nothing, because she did not need to say anything, because she had warned him, and he had not listened. And now 1,000 ships were gone in the time it takes to blink. But the Valkyrie were not cowards, and they did not break easily, because they were warriors born and bred, and even in the chaos and the shock they fought back, and they fought hard. The battle that followed the 3 seconds was not clean, and it was not easy, and it was brutal and bloody and terrible on both sides, because the Valkyrie were still elite soldiers, even without their shields, and their weapons were still powerful. Ships were still massive, and they killed humans by the hundreds. The Wraith swarms took casualties as Valkyrie gunners adapted and began targeting the small, fast corvettes with spread-pattern weapons. And human cruisers were hit, and human destroyers were cracked open, and human beings died in the cold vacuum of space, and their names would later be added to walls and memorials and songs. But humanity had prepared for 40 years, and the Valkyrie had prepared for 3 days, and that difference was everything. The tactical AI systems coordinating the human fleet adapted in real time, and every time the Valkyrie adjusted their tactics, the AI adjusted faster, and found new gaps and new weaknesses, and exploited them without mercy. And then the boarding parties launched. The Terran Marines had been waiting in armored dropships, and when the order came, they flew straight into the wreckage-filled battlefield, and they latched on to crippled Valkyrie dreadnoughts, and they cut through the hulls with plasma torches, and they went inside. No species in the galaxy had ever been insane enough to board a Valkyrie warship, because the Valkyrie were 8 feet tall and covered in scales like iron, and they were terrifying in close combat. And every sane species knew that you did not fight a Valkyrie face to face. But humans were not entirely sane, and the Marines were wearing powered exoskeleton armor that made them strong enough to match a Valkyrie in hand-to-hand combat. And they carried weapons designed specifically for fighting in the tight corridors of enemy ships. And they were angry, and they were trained, and they were not afraid. The fighting inside the dreadnoughts was the worst kind of war, which was the kind where you can see the enemy's eyes, and the Marines paid for every corridor and every room with blood. But they took those corridors and those rooms, and they did not give them back. On Earth, Ambassador Ilaram Wangi stood in the War Council Command Center, and she watched the battle unfold on holographic displays that showed every ship and every missile and every death in real time. And she was not celebrating because she could see the human ships that were burning, and she could see the casualty numbers climbing, and each number was a person, and each person had a name. 47 minutes after the battle began, the Valkyrie Armada had been reduced from 4,000 ships to fewer than 900 functional vessels. And those 900 were damaged and scattered and surrounded. And then something happened that had never happened in the entire history of the Valkyrie Dominion. Drathos Vel gave the order to retreat. The word tasted like poison in his mouth, and his officers stared at him as if he had spoken in a language they did not understand. Because no Valkyrie fleet had ever retreated, and no Valkyrie warlord had ever given that command. And the word itself was almost forgotten in their language because they had never needed it. But Drathos Vel was many things, and stupid was not one of them. And he could see the numbers, and the numbers said that if he stayed, he would lose everything, and he would not give the humans the satisfaction of total destruction. The surviving Valkyrie ships turned and ran for the FTL jump point. And as they limped away, trailing smoke and fire and debris, Ambassador Ilaram Wangi opened a channel on the same frequency she had used 3 days earlier, and her voice went out across the galaxy. "Supreme Warlord," she said, and her voice was calm and steady and cold. "You have your 3 seconds, and now take your dead and go." The Valkyrie fleet jumped to FTL and vanished, and the space around Earth was quiet, except for the sound of rescue ships searching the wreckage for survivors. Humanity had won, but Elara did not smile, because she knew that winning a battle was not the same as winning a war, and she knew that Drathos Vel was not the kind of enemy who accepted defeat, and she knew that whatever came next would be harder than what had come before. She was right. The news traveled at the speed of light across 1,000 star systems, and it carried with it a truth that rewrote the political map of the galaxy in a single day. And that truth was this: the Valkyrie Dominion had been beaten, and they had been beaten badly, and they had been beaten by the species that everyone had been laughing at 3 days ago. The reaction across the galaxy was not celebration, and it was not relief, and it was fear. Because if the humans could do that to the Valkyrie, then what could they do to everyone else? Every major galactic power immediately began reassessing its relationship with Earth, and intelligence agencies on 100 worlds pulled their files on humanity and read them again with new eyes. And what they found in those files terrified them, because the files said that humans were a minor species with a small fleet and modest technology. And now everyone knew that the files were wrong. And if the files were wrong about this, were they wrong about the Galactic Council, which was the closest thing the galaxy had to a government, called an emergency session, and the assembly hall was full for the first time in decades, because every species wanted to be present for what was about to happen. The irony was thick enough to choke on, because these were the same species that had done nothing when the Velhari Armada appeared above Earth, and some of them had actually been negotiating salvage rights for Earth's remains, and now those same species were falling over themselves to send congratulatory messages to the Terran Confederation, and to pretend that they had always believed in humanity's strength. The Council's official position was that they wanted to mediate peace between Earth and the Velhari Dominion, but what they actually wanted was to contain humanity, and to make sure that this new and terrifying power stayed under the Council's control, because the Council was very good at one thing. That thing was making sure that no species became powerful enough to challenge the existing order. Ambassador Alara Mwangi saw through this immediately, because she had spent 20 years in diplomacy, and she knew exactly what it looked like when powerful people pretended to help while actually trying to put a leash on you. But before she could deal with the Council, she had to deal with what was happening at home. The Terran Confederation was not united in victory, and the fractures appeared almost immediately, because the military commanders wanted to press the advantage and strike the Velkhari Dominion while it was weakened. They argued that the Dominion would recover eventually and come back stronger, and that the smart move was to finish them now. The diplomats disagreed, and they argued that if humanity launched an offensive war against the Dominion, then every fear that every species in the galaxy had about humans would be confirmed, and Earth would become the new monster under the bed, and instead of one enemy, they would have 1,000. Alara stood in the middle of this argument, and she fought for restraint. And she did not fight for it because she had any love for the Velkhari, because she had none, but because she understood something that the generals did not. And what she understood was that the battle they had just won was not the real war. The real war was for the soul of humanity's future in the galaxy, and how they acted in victory would define them for centuries, and if they chose vengeance, they would become exactly what the Velkhari were, which was a species that used its strength to crush others. And Alara had seen what that looked like on Rethus, and she would rather die than let her people become that. While Earth argued about its future, the Velkhari Dominion was falling apart. Drathos Vel returned to the Dominion's homeworld with fewer than 900 ships out of 4,000, and the political consequences were immediate and savage, because the Velkhari respected strength above all things, and losing was the ultimate weakness. The ruling council stripped him of his fleet command in a ceremony that was broadcast across the Dominion, and it was meant to humiliate him. And it worked, because for a Velkhari warrior, there was no greater shame than having your command taken from you in front of your own people. But Drathos Vel was not broken, and he was not finished, because his humiliation had burned away everything soft inside him, and what was left was pure cold rage. The defeat had done something else that was far more dangerous than wounding one warlord's pride, and what it had done was shatter the Dominion's aura of invincibility. And that aura had been the foundation of their entire empire, because most of their conquered species had never tried to rebel, because they believed rebellion was impossible, because the Velkhari could not be beaten. But now, the Velkhari had been beaten, and the conquered species knew it. And across a dozen star systems, revolts began to spark like fires in dry grass. And species that had been enslaved for centuries suddenly remembered what freedom tasted like. and they wanted more. The Dominion was cracking from the inside, and Drathos Vel watched it happen, and he decided that if the Dominion was going to fall, then he would make sure that Earth fell first. He gathered his loyalists, which were the officers and soldiers who still believed in him, and he went to a place that was forbidden in Velkari law, and that place was the Vault of Endings, which was a weapons storage facility deep in the core of the Dominion's territory. And inside the vault were 3 planet killers. Planet killers were weapons so terrible that even the Velkari had banned them centuries ago, because they did not just destroy cities or armies or fleets, but they destabilized a planet's core and turned the entire world into an uninhabitable ruin. The Velkari had banned them not out of mercy, but because a dead planet was a useless planet, and you could not enslave people who did not exist. But Drathos Vel was beyond strategy now, and he was beyond logic, and he was beyond the laws of his own people, and he wanted one thing, and that thing was the complete and total destruction of Earth and everyone on it. While this was happening, Ilara received a visitor on Earth, and the visitor was someone she had not expected. Elder Vass of the Koreshi arrived on a small and ancient ship that looked like it might fall apart at any moment, and he was an old creature with a body like a mantis made of polished wood and compound eyes that reflected light like gems, and he moved slowly, but his mind was sharp as a blade. The Koreshi were the species that had sent Ilara the encrypted message before the battle, telling her not to hesitate, and they had nearly been destroyed by the Velkari centuries ago, and they had survived by going underground and building a vast intelligence network that stretched across the Dominion like invisible roots. Elder Vass came with 2 gifts. The first gift was information, and the information was that Drathos Vel had taken the planet killers and was preparing to use them against Earth. The second gift was an offer, and the offer was this: the Koreshi would share their entire intelligence network with humanity, and not as charity, but as a partnership between 2 species that knew what it meant to look extinction in the face and refuse to blink. "We have watched you," Elder Vass said to Ilara, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling. "And we have watched you for 40 years, and we saw what no other species saw, which is that you were not the fools you pretended to be. And we recognized you because we are the same, and we survived by being underestimated, and so did you." Ilara looked at the old Koreshi, and she felt something she had not felt since the battle, which was hope, and not hope for survival, because she already knew they could survive, but hope for something better, which was a future where species stood together instead of alone. The Terran War Council reviewed the intelligence about the planet killers, and the room went very quiet, because a planet killer aimed at Earth would end everything, and shields would not stop it, and fleets would not stop it, and the only way to stop it was to destroy it before it could fire. Ilara was given a new mission, and the mission was twofold, and the first part was military, which was to find and stop the planet killers, and the second part was political, which was to go to the Galactic Council and secure alliances and formal recognition of Earth's right to self-defense, before the Council could impose sanctions and isolate humanity. She traveled to the Galactic Council station on the fastest ship the Confederation had, and when she arrived, she walked through the grand corridor that led to the assembly chamber, and every alien diplomat she passed fell silent. Some of them bowed, and some of them glared, and some of them simply stared. And all of them moved out of her way, because 3 days ago she had been a joke, and now she was the most famous diplomat in the galaxy, and they could see in her eyes that she was not finished yet. Behind her as she walked, encrypted transmissions from Koreshi intelligence agents confirmed what everyone feared. Drathos Vel's planet killers were armed, and they were moving, and Earth was in the crosshairs again, and the clock was ticking. Ilara did not slow down, and she did not look back, and she walked into the assembly chamber with the same calm she had carried on the shuttle when she had faced the entire Velkari armada alone. The galaxy had trembled when humanity won its first battle, and now it was about to learn whether humanity could win the peace. Ilara stood at the center of the Galactic Assembly Chamber, and around her rose tier after tier of seats, filled with representatives of over 200 species, and every single one of them was watching her, and the silence was so deep that she could hear her own heartbeat. She did not beg, and she did not threaten, and she did not play games. 3 days ago, she said, the Velkari Dominion appeared above my world with 4,000 warships, and they gave my people a choice between slavery and extinction, and we chose neither. She paused and looked around the chamber, at the faces and the eyes, and the tentacles and the mandibles of every species present. And in that moment, not one of you stood with us, and I am not here to accuse you of that, because fear is not a crime, and silence in the face of a predator is a survival instinct that every species understands. She let that settle, and it settled hard. But I am here to ask you a question, and the question is simple, and it is this. If it had been your world and your children and your future, would you have wanted someone to stand with you? No one spoke, and no one moved, and the silence answered for them. Behind the scenes, Ilara had already been building something, and she had been building it in quiet meetings, and encrypted conversations, and private dinners. And what she had been building was a coalition. The Koreshi joined first, because they had been fighting the Velkari in the shadows for centuries, and they were tired of fighting alone, and their intelligence network was the finest in the galaxy. The Torvani joined second, because they were an aquatic species with the most advanced sensor technology in known space, and they had been quietly terrified of the Velkari for generations, and they saw in humanity something they had never seen before, which was a species that could actually protect them. The Dren Collective joined third, because they were a machine. Intelligent species, and they respected humanity's integration of AI into their military. And they calculated that an alliance with Earth had a higher probability of long-term survival than neutrality. It was not a large coalition, but it did not need to be large, because it needed to be fast, and it needed to be precise, and it needed to stop 3 planet killers before they reached Earth. Koreshi intelligence had tracked Drathos Vel's loyalist fleet, and they knew exactly where he was going, and they knew exactly when he would get there, because the only path from the Vault of Endings to Earth ran through a narrow hyperspace corridor called the Erithus Corridor, and that corridor was the bottleneck where the trap would be set. Admiral Chen Wei commanded the combined fleet, and it was the strangest fleet ever assembled in galactic history, because it contained human wraith corvettes flying alongside Koreshi stealth ships that were shaped like black thorns and Torvani sensor platforms that looked like floating jellyfish made of crystal, and Dren electronic warfare vessels that hummed with the cold energy of machine thought. 4 species that had never fought together were about to fight together for the first time, and they had exactly 72 hours to learn how. Chen Wei was not a man who gave speeches, but he said one thing to the combined fleet before they jumped to the Erithus corridor, and what he said was this: "We are not here to win glory, and we are not here to prove anything, and we are here because 3 weapons are pointed at a world full of people, and our job is to make sure those weapons never fire, and that is all, and that is enough." The fleet jumped. They arrived at the Erithus corridor 14 hours before Drathos Vel's loyalist fleet was expected, and they spread out across the corridor like a net made of steel and silence, and the Koreshi ships vanished into stealth mode, and the Torvani sensors reached out like invisible fingers, and the Dren began jamming every frequency that the Velkari used for communication. And the human wraiths arranged themselves in attack formations and waited. 14 hours of silence and tension, and then the Velkari arrived. Drathos Vel's loyalist fleet dropped out of FTL, and it was smaller than the original armada, but it was still dangerous, because it contained over 600 warships, crewed by fanatics who believed in their warlord, and more importantly, it contained 3 planet killers, which were massive cylindrical vessels, each one the size of a city, and each one carrying enough destructive power to murder an entire world. The trap closed. The Koreshi stealth ships struck first, and they came out of nowhere, like ghosts with knives, and they targeted the communication arrays on the Valkyrie escorts. And within seconds, the Loyalist fleet was blind and deaf and unable to coordinate. The Torvani sensors fed real-time targeting data to the entire Coalition fleet, and every ship knew exactly where every enemy was and what they were doing and where they were going before they got there. The Dren electronic warfare vessels poured chaos into the Valkyrie computer systems, and navigation panels went dark, and weapon systems glitched, and engines stuttered, and the Loyalist fleet was fighting not just an enemy fleet, but an invisible enemy inside their own machines. And then the Wraiths hit. They came from every direction at once, and their kinetic lances tore through escort ships and cleared paths toward the three planet killers, and the Valkyrie fought back, because they always fought back, and the battle was vicious, and ships died on both sides in flashes of light and expanding clouds of debris. But the objective was not to destroy the fleet, and the objective was the planet killers, and everything else was secondary. The Terran Marines launched again, and they flew their boarding craft straight through the hell of the battlefield toward the three massive cylindrical ships, and anti-aircraft fire from the planet killers tore some of the boarding craft apart, and Marines died before they could even reach the hull, and their names would be remembered. But enough got through, and they cut into the planet killers with plasma torches, and they went inside. The fighting inside was the worst any of them had ever seen, because the planet killers were crewed by Valkyrie loyalists who would rather die than surrender, and the corridors were narrow, and the gravity was heavy, and every room was a potential death trap, and the Marines paid for every meter with blood and sweat and broken bones. Sergeant Anya Okafor led the assault team on the first planet killer, and she was 29 years old, and she had a photograph of her daughter taped inside her helmet. And she fought through 7 compartments and lost 4 of her squad, and she reached the firing mechanism, and she disabled it with 30 seconds to spare before it could launch its payload. Lieutenant Park Jin-ho led the team on the second planet killer, and his team breached the engine room and destroyed the propulsion system, so that even if the weapon fired, it would not reach Earth. And he took a Valkyrie blade across his chest plate, and survived only because the exoskeleton armor held. The third planet killer was the hardest, because Drathos Val had placed his best warriors there, and the Marines who went in did not all come out, but the ones who survived reached the core, and they shut it down, and when the last planet killer went offline, a cheer erupted across the Coalition fleet that could be heard on every channel. Meanwhile, Drathos Vel's flagship was crippled and burning, and the Supreme Warlord stood on his broken bridge, surrounded by the bodies of his officers. And he looked at the destruction of everything he had built and everything he had believed in, and he reached for the self-destruct control, because if he could not win, then he would make sure that his enemies gained nothing from his defeat. But a hand stopped him. Sub-Commander Yisha, who had warned him before the first battle, and who had been ignored, and who had quietly been in contact with Koreshi agents for weeks, stood behind him. And she had overridden the self-destruct with a command code that she had prepared for exactly this moment. "It is over," she said to him, and her voice was steady, and her eyes were clear. "And you led us here, and I will not let you kill what remains of our people for your pride." She opened a channel to the Coalition fleet, and she surrendered the remaining Valkyrie forces, and Drathos Vel was taken alive. And for a Valkyrie warrior, there was no greater humiliation than being captured by an enemy and forced to live with defeat. The Battle of the Erithus Corridor was over, and the planet killers were neutralized, and the Loyalist fleet was broken, and the threat to Earth was ended. In the weeks that followed, the Valkyrie Dominion, which had already been cracking from internal revolts, collapsed entirely. Conquered species across a dozen star systems declared independence, and the 1,000-year empire that had terrorized the galaxy came apart like a house built on sand. The Galactic Council, formally recognized Earth's actions as legitimate self-defense, and they ratified the coalition that Alara had built into a new treaty called the Mutual Defense Compact. It was the first military alliance in galactic history that was not controlled by the Council. And everyone knew that humanity had engineered it. And everyone knew that the galaxy would never be the same. Months later, on a quiet evening on Earth, Ambassador Alara Mwangi stood at a memorial wall that had been built in Geneva. On that wall were the names of every person who had died in both battles, and there were thousands of names, and some of them were human. Were Kireshi, and some of them were Torvani, and some of them were Dren. Elder Vass stood beside her, and his ancient body cast a long shadow in the fading light, and he was quiet for a while, and then he spoke. "Do you regret what you said to them?" he asked. The 3 seconds. Ilara looked at the names on the wall, and she thought about all of them, and she thought about the ones she had known, and the ones she had not, and she thought about what it cost to stand up when the galaxy told you to kneel. "No," she said quietly, "but I wish it had not needed to be said." They stood together in silence as the sun went down, and the names on the wall caught the last light. Years later, on a world that had once been part of the Velkari Dominion, a young Velkari student sat in a classroom and watched the famous recording of Ambassador Ilara Mwangi's original transmission. And she watched the human woman look into the camera and say the words that had changed the world. "Galaxy." Her teacher, who was a former Velkari soldier with scars on his scales, paused the recording and asked the class what they thought. The young student thought for a long time, and then she said, "She was not threatening us, and she was warning us." The teacher looked at her and nodded slowly, and his old eyes held something that might have been respect. "That is the most dangerous thing about humans," he said. "They always mean exactly what they say." And across the galaxy, in every language and on every world, the story was told and retold, and it always began the same way. The aliens gave Earth 3 days to surrender, and the human ambassador said, "You will not last 3 seconds."